Coming up on this episode, the blockbuster trade between the New York Knicks and the Minnesota Timberwolves. Who's the winner? Who's the loser? And what does it mean for the Golden State Warriors, not only in the present, but the future as well? Welcome back to the Golden State with Mates podcast. Hope you're all having or had a good weekend, depending on where you may be. Grand final weekend, always a good one in Australia. But again, unfortunately, the game on Saturday was very, very disappointing. For you guys in America, just imagine a Super Bowl that, the margin was over 30 points, basically. It was over 60 points in this AFL Grand Final, and the scoring in AFL is a lot easier than NFL. So, very disappointing. We seem to have these blowout Grand Finals more often than not. And, it's just disappointing because as a neutral fan, when my team's not in it, I just want a good, close game. And it seems that unless my team is in it, we can't get a good close game. In the last 18 years, I think there's been 3 grand finals decided by less than 10 points, and my team's been involved in all of them. And that just brings, as you guys would know as fans, that just brings an emotional stress to it, which means you can't really enjoy it in a way that you may be able to if you didn't have a dog in the fight and you were just able to enjoy the game itself without, going for a team necessarily. But yeah, disappointing, but otherwise a good weekend. Let's get on to the basketball. So, Josh and I recorded a podcast episode Saturday morning my time, Friday night in America. Recorded about an hour before the trade came out. I think that the trade was reported about the same time as the episode was published. So we did that entire episode without obviously knowing the massive blockbuster trade between the Knicks and the Timberwolves surrounding obviously Julius, Randle and Donte DiVincenzo going to the Timberwolves and Karl-Anthony Towns going to the Knicks. Sounds like the Charlotte Hornets will also be involved, which I'll talk about a little bit more in a minute, just in terms of the creativity of this deal. But I think there's still reports earlier today that this deal has not been completed yet, but that it's well on its way. And obviously the players involved won't be at their new respective media days or anything like that, but they certainly won't be at their old ones. I don't think it sounds like it's going to fall over in any way. So a massive shock trade on the eve of the season. Absolutely crazy. And this is why I love the NBA, and I've been speaking about it with mates since. Like, this is the unpredictability of the NBA that I know in Australian sport we just don't get. Like, something like this wouldn't happen on the eve of the season in terms of a blockbuster trade involving multiple all-star players. It's quite unbelievable. My initial reaction to this, and I suppose my takeaway from this right now, is that from a purely on-court perspective, I think this is a win for the Knicks and a loss for the Timberwolves. I think the Knicks obviously desperately needed a center. Mitchell Robinson going down with injury out for a couple of months. What were they going to do there? Were they going to start Randle at the 5? Were they going to bring in Jericho Sims or Precious Achiuwa or something like that? There are a lot of question marks there. So the fact they can now bring in Karl-Anthony Towns, they needed a center. Sounds like Robinson might now be on the trade market himself. I think it's a big win for them. Obviously, the costs from a financial perspective, I'll dive into. But I think the Knicks, as a result of this trade, are a better team again. And the fact that they've, in the last 9 months, been able to bring in OG Anunoby, bring in Mikal Bridges. And I think most of us thought after that Bridges trade that, this is just the Knicks team, right? They can't do too much from here because of the financial constraints, because of the lack of assets and all the assets they gave up for Bridges. The fact that you can go and now get a 4-time All-Star, former number 1 overall pick in Karl-Anthony Towns after making that Bridges trade, I think comes as a massive shock to many. So I think Towns not only is a better player than Randle, but he's just clearly a better fit. And there was always going to be some concerns with the kind of lineups that Tibbs runs during the season in terms of how much can Randle play at the 5. I think that would have worked for what it's worth. I think having Randle and Anunoby as your 4-5 combination, I think would have worked. But we haven't really seen it from Randle, and it's going to be interesting to see if they run it a little bit in Minnesota as well with him at the 5, because my concern from a Minnesota perspective, I get why they did it financially, and again, I'll get into that. But I think they are a worse team going from Karl-Anthony Towns to Julius Randle and Donte DiVincenzo. I really love Donte. Part of me wishes he was still at the Warriors. Obviously, the Warriors were never able to do that financially in free agency going back to last year. But Donte is semi-replaceable. And for the Knicks, he was always going to be probably their seventh man, I would say. And I think in Minnesota, he might be the seventh man as well, if you're thinking the starting five, and then Naz Reid is the sixth man or whatever. So he's any seventh man in the league is really replaceable. And from a Knicks perspective, I wouldn't be concerned too much. Now, yes, the shooting, he brought that, but so does Towns to a degree. It's just in a different position. And a guy like Miles McBride, you can just bring in, give him a whole lot of minutes that you would have otherwise given DiVincenzo. And McBride was really good for them last season. So I don't have too many concerns about it from a Knicks perspective. Yes, it's a nice addition for Minnesota. But again, I think they've gone backwards with this. We had so many concerns early days with the Towns Gobert front court, and that actually obviously smoothed itself out and proved fairly effective last season, getting them all the way to the Western Conference Finals. But I have more concerns now with Randle and Gobert, simply because of the lack of spacing. Obviously, having Towns and Gobert, two genuine centers, you could always get away with it because, Towns, the self-proclaimed best big man shooter of all time. Now, Randle is a high-volume three-point shooter. There's no doubt about that. He gets them up, but he's not a good three-point shooter necessarily. Doesn't make them at a high rate. And I am wondering if both of those guys can be in their closing lineups. Now, they may well be in the starting lineups. I think they have to be, given Randle's making $29 million and Gobert's making over 40 or whatever it is. So they have to be in the starting lineup, but whether or not they're in the closing lineups, I highly doubt it. I think they might try to start the season, but I think they might see that that's pretty ineffective pretty early on. And so as a result, I would see, Minnesota's best lineup and closing lineup as having like Conley, Edwards, McDaniels, one of Randle or Gobert, and then one of Naz Reid if you want to stay big, Donte if you want that extra little bit of shooting, or Alexander Walker if you want that a little bit less shooting than Donte, but maybe a little bit more defense. One of those three guys I think will close lineups ahead of either Rudy or Julius Randle. And it's going to be interesting to see because we saw Rudy get benched for France during the Olympics, and things kind of took a turn for him last season where everyone was kind of looking at how bad the trade was. And I think there's still a belief by most, widely held belief, that trade was still not a great one for Minnesota, but the fact that they were able to do what they did last season and reach the conference finals, I think there was a massive turn there in terms of Gobert and how we see him and how we see that trade necessarily. But I think that could go downhill pretty quickly again, just based on this fit with Julius Randle. So I think the Timberwolves are worse. I think the Knicks are better. And overall, that's clearly a good thing for the Warriors, where you've got one of the best teams in the West, one of the teams who were cited to be, a top four team again. The fact that they're now worse, the fact you're going to play those guys four times during the regular season, I think it's clearly a good trade from a Warriors perspective in terms of Minnesota getting worse. And I think the other thing with this is you've also got to think just the change and the unknown of these blockbuster trades and taking out probably your second best player, like Cat was their second best player, taking that caliber of player out, and maybe it actually makes them better. Who knows? Maybe it makes them better. But the unknown of that at this stage lends yourself into thinking that, okay, this could really go downhill to a point where could the Warriors be better than Minnesota this season? Maybe. Yeah, maybe. Now, did I think that before the trade? No, I didn't think that the Warriors could be better than Minnesota. But now, as a result of this trade, I think the Timberwolves are worse. And just the unknown of bringing Julius Randle, Donte DiVincenzo, taking out your second best player, who knows? Who knows? Maybe that's a point of optimism for the Warriors to think, okay, we need to jump ahead. Like, we finished 10th last season. Who are we going to jump ahead in the Western Conference this season? Maybe all of a sudden the Timberwolves have gone for a team that you thought, no, we probably can't quite reach that level too. Well, you know what? They could come back down to our level and maybe below it, and we could actually be a better team than Minnesota. So I think from a Warriors perspective, it's a good trade for them. It does open up some interesting things in terms of the league-wide perspective, because there's no doubt that Minnesota have done this for financial reasons. They obviously Cat starting his 4-year, $220 million contract or whatever it is. They clearly wanted to try and get out from under that before it got too difficult, before it got to a point where, one, they were really hit hard and they were forced to make a decision. And once you're forced to make a decision, you clearly don't have the leverage that you otherwise would have. And I don't think they necessarily had too much leverage in this situation either, because I think we see this kind of package that's given up for Karl-Anthony Towns and think, oh, that's not a whole lot compared to the talent of player he is. So it does open up questions, and specifically for the Warriors as well, in terms of the second apron stuff. And they've obviously done a good job themselves of getting out of that with, waiving Chris Paul's contract and, Clay going, and then getting these, valuable mid-tier contracts, now hard cap themselves at the first tax apron. But it is a warning to other teams around the league that it's going to be difficult to be able to sustain these high payrolls for years on end, and particularly if you're a franchise like Minnesota, who clearly haven't necessarily been too willing to spend huge dollars in the past, and it seems like they don't really want to do that necessarily. And it's going to be interesting to see what they do with Randle, who's extension eligible, but I'm really fascinated to see where the Warriors go from here, because they've got this one season now where they are hard capped at the first apron. They won't necessarily see or be hit by the punitive rules, the CBA rules that have come into place in terms of the second apron and whatever else. But that could very, very quickly change by next season. If you're talking about Jonathan Kuminga and Moses Moody contracts, and that's, I suppose, the big question mark right now for Golden State. We are, 22 days from the deadline for those guys. Incidentally, Mike Dunleavy Jr. said a couple of days ago that there's some positive talks going on. I don't know how much to buy into that, given the reports have kind of been on the contrary to that. But you're talking about a guy like Jonathan Kuminga. Well, if he's going from the $7.6 million he's making this season, and all of a sudden you give him a $30 million contract, then bang, all of a sudden, without making other moves, without letting D'Anthony Melton walk in free agency, then the Warriors are going to be back in a similar position as what they've been in over the past few years. And do they have the team necessarily to be able to afford that and be, if you're going to be above the second tax apron or around there, you've got to be one of the best teams in the league. You can't be what the Warriors were last season, where you've got the highest payroll in the league and you're 10th in the conference. You just cannot do that in today's day and age. So I think it's a bit disappointing, the fact that teams have to make these brutal decisions like the Timberwolves would with Cat, or did with Cat, because I think in an ideal world, they would have kept Cat. He's been there for nearly a decade. They would have ran it back, but obviously the financial implications have hurt them and forced them into doing this move. I do really wonder where the Warriors are going, because not only did you have the contract discussions with Kuminga and Moody, but their trade discussions as well. So if you're talking about what they tried to do this offseason in terms of Paul George, the Warriors were willing to be above the second tax apron again, most likely, had they traded Chris Paul, Andrew Wiggins' salaries for Paul George. Because obviously, if you just add Chris Paul's $30 million contract to the books right now, you see where you end up. And that's what they would have done. They would have had to guarantee that contract to be able to get to Paul George. And that would have put them above the second tax apron. So they were willing to do it for Paul George. They were willing to then hand him a 4-year, $220 million extension. What would that have meant for Kuminga and Moody? And then Markkanen's in a similar situation. Now, it wouldn't have affected necessarily for this season, because he was only making $17.2 million initially. It depends if you wanted to renegotiate and extend the contract like Utah ultimately did. But even if you didn't do that, it would have come to free agency. You would have had to pay him over $40 million a year. And again, you would have been right back in this situation where you're above the second tax apron. So where do the Warriors want to go from here? Do they want to maintain under the first tax aprons for years, for multiple seasons in a row? Or are they willing to say, okay, we're going to have this one kind of down season where we're under the first tax apron, and then we understand that from that position, we're probably going to go straight back up. There's guys with multiple year contracts. Wiggins still got 3 years to go. Draymond's still got 2 years plus a player option. So it's hard to necessarily get out from these deals. And if you want to add someone to the books, then, I mean, Slow-Mo is on a multi-year deal. Buddy Hield's on a multi-year deal. Melton's the one that I suppose, that's $12.8 million you could just let walk in free agency next offseason. But it's an interesting position that the Warriors are in, and every team is in a position like this where they have to manage what they're doing financially and try and get around these punitive aprons that the NBA have brought in. I suppose the other thing from a Warriors perspective with this trade is whenever something like this happens, whenever any notable trade happens and it doesn't involve the Warriors, it brings us back to the Warriors drawing criticism for their lack of activity and this idea that Mike Dunleavy Jr. sprouted just before June's NBA draft that trades are difficult, getting deals done are difficult. Well, again, that's kind of that sentiment is kind of not really relating to the New York Knicks right now because, as I said before, in the last 9 months have made blockbuster trades for OG Anunoby, Mikal Bridges, now Karl-Anthony Towns. They're pushing the buttons around like it's NBA 2K, while the Warriors seemingly can't do anything. And again, the Warriors' lack of activity, fans are growing frustrated of. I think in every individual specific situation, you can point to reasons as to why you didn't make these trades. Like Karl-Anthony Towns, for example, like if you look at him, should the Warriors have had interest in Karl-Anthony Towns? Did they miss an opportunity there? I just think it would have been too difficult. I've always been intrigued by Cat. I'm not his biggest fan, but he's a very, very talented offensive player. There's no doubt about that. I don't think he's a number one. I think he's a number two. That's why I would have been happy for him to, like if I was Minnesota, I would have been happy to keep him. Again, the financial restraints means that, they weren't able to do that. But, the Warriors, number two alongside Steph, I could have seen that. Now, the Warriors have never really had as talented as an offensive big man as Cat is, and how that would have worked, I don't know. But it also intrigued me from that perspective as well, because it could have unlocked the Warriors, in a few different ways, and having, Draymond playing next to him could have tried and, hidden Cat's defensive weaknesses a little bit. I've always talked about the idea of a shooting five. Steve's talked about the idea of a shooting five when it comes to playing Jonathan Kuminga at the three and all these different lineups and combinations that it could open up. I spoke recently about it with Quentin Post. So I'm certainly intrigued. I was intrigued by Karl-Anthony Towns and his potential fit at the Golden State Warriors. However, the $49.2 million he's making this season, it was always going to be very, very difficult for the Warriors to get to that salary. And I think that's what we have to understand here is that you're talking about not having the contracts of Melton, Anderson, and Hield eligible to be traded right now. Now, once those guys do become trade eligible, then getting to a mark like 49.2 million or like Jimmy Butler, I think is at 48.8 or whatever he's at, getting to these kind of near $50 million price ranges, that can be done when you've got all these mid-tier contracts available to you. But right now at present, it basically, the Warriors could still get to it. Like it's possible, but it's like, okay, Wiggins, GP2, Looney, and Kuminga. But then if you're Minnesota, you're not going to take on Kuminga because the whole reason you're getting rid of Towns is for the financial reasons. And then what, you're going to bring on Kuminga and then turn around and give him $30 million. Like they're not going to do that. And so getting a deal done with Minnesota was always going to be difficult. Now, I suppose you could go back and think, well, okay, what about when we had Chris Paul's contract? Could we have given them Chris Paul's contract and he could have been a backup point guard for them? I don't know. It just would have, I don't think Minnesota would have done that. I just think it's in this situation, it would have been too difficult. And again, there's every individual scenario, there's reasons as to why you wouldn't make a trade, right? The Clippers won with Paul George. That wasn't about the Warriors. That was about them just not wanting to make the trade, which is fair enough. The Jazz, the Warriors, clearly not wanting to give up too much in the way of young talent and future assets. Danny Ainge wanted to absolutely take everything from the Warriors, and you can understand why Golden State weren't willing to give up absolutely everything for a guy who's a 27, 28-year-old, and he's only made one All-Star team at this point, as much as Markkanen, I think, would have been great on the Warriors. So all these individual scenarios. Siakam last season apparently didn't want to stick around beyond last season with the Warriors if he was traded there. There's always reasons as to not make these trades, right? But the collective is, well, all these guys have been available. How come you haven't been able to pull off one? How come you haven't been able to make one notable move? When was like the Warriors' last notable move aside from like pull for Paul last offseason? Right? They trade, mid-season. They just don't make mid-season trades. It's like the Wiggins one back in 2020, yeah, sure. But aside from that, mid-season last season, they deal Corey Joseph to the Pacers for financial reasons, doesn't count. GP2 for Wiseman, I mean, it's notable that you gave up a former second overall pick, but at that point, he was a bit part rotation player at best. You bring in a guy in GP2 who was injured and was never going to have too much of an impact on the remainder of your season. The year before that, championship season, they didn't make a deal mid-season. That was fine. Obviously, they won the championship, so they can't be faulted for that. But if you look at the last 5 years, the Warriors, I suppose throughout, getting KD and then getting DeMarcus Cousins, both they were free agents, obviously, they became known as this team that were willing to take big swings and go hard at players. And, maybe we're seeing that to a degree as well this offseason with Paul George and Larry Marketing. But aside from that, you look at the last 5 years, how many multi-time All-Stars, how many All-Stars have they brought in the last 5 years? They've brought in 2. D'Angelo Russell was a one-time All-Star in the sign and trade for KD when he went to the Brooklyn Nets, lasted 33 games. The other one was Chris Paul, who was 38 years old, was clearly not an All-Star caliber player anymore, brought him in for financial reasons, waived him a year later, right? So the Warriors really, via trade, have not brought in anyone of any major note, aside from Wiggins in that Russell trade, who Wiggins was a bad asset at the time, and the Warriors, fortunately, and to their credit, developed him to a point where he's the second best player in the championship team and, an All-Star as well that season. So it's just the lack of activity is growing tiresome for fans. And again, there's always reasons in every individual instance as to why to not make a trade. But in the collective, we've got a history now of like, hey, come on. You can't say that trades are that difficult when the New York Knicks are going out and doing what they're doing, when all the other good teams in the league are doing what they're doing in terms of the Dallas Mavericks going out mid-season, getting PJ Washington, Daniel Gafford, the Boston Celtics, NBA champions, going out and getting Drew Holiday and Kristaps Porzingis last offseason. Like, the good teams are going out and finding a way to make these deals get done. And I don't know if it's the Warriors and like a lack of creativity, because when I first heard this trade, I thought, okay, well, what else is involved in the deal? Because DiVincenzo and Randle are only like $40 million and Towns is at $49.2 million. So the salaries don't really work. And then I hear that Charlotte are involved and they're getting some kind of draft incentives in there to be able to work out and match the salaries. And I'm thinking, well, did the Warriors try that, whether it was with Paul George or whoever it was? Are the Warriors creative enough to get third, fourth teams involved? Now, I suppose we can look at the 6-team sign and trade. That was like the most teams ever involved in a trade and think, oh, yeah, they were willing to do that. But that was like, I mean, that's during free agency. That's when you're just trying to make things work from really turning free agency signings into sign and trades. And it wasn't involving anyone that was making more than what Clay is, which is what, $17 million with the Dallas Mavericks or whatever. It's not a blockbuster trade where guys are making over $30 million. I just wonder if there's enough creativity there, because I see the Knicks and the Timberwolves bring in, and I'm sure this would have been probably from the Knicks' perspective, bring in the Charlotte Hornets, incentivizing them with draft assets, and we still don't know what the final deal is, but I see that and think that's clever. That's good work to be able to get that done, to be able to bring a third team in and do this trade to where you're not completely, if you're the Knicks, you're not completely gutting your team for a $49.2 million player. Yes, you're taking out Julius Randle, but you're still a good team without him last season. Yes, you're taking out Donte DiVincenzo, who's a very good player, but is ultimately, a seventh man for you. This would have been a seventh man for you this season and will probably still be a seventh man for the Timberwolves. And so that's really good business to be able to do that in a way that doesn't gut your team, because that's the issue with the Warriors right now, is if they were to trade for a Karl-Anthony Towns or a Jimmy Butler or anyone around $50 million, you'll be gutting your team to do so. And maybe that's what the Warriors are prepared for, because they do have a relatively deep team. And so maybe they can cover that hit a bit better than other teams. But it's just the Warriors' lack of activity. The fans are, growing tired of it. And whenever a notable trade, and this is a shock blockbuster trade, whenever something like this happens, it just reiterates the Warriors' lack of activity over recent seasons and inability to get this roster significantly better around Stephen Curry. The last thing I wanted to mention, the irony in all of this is that, as I said, Donte DiVincenzo probably would have been seventh man for the Knicks, probably will be seventh man for the Timberwolves. if he'd remained at the Warriors, and again, this was financially impossible because the Warriors were limited to offering him, I think, $5.4 million in free agency going back to last year. But if you're still with the Warriors, he'd probably be a starter right now. He'd probably start next to Steph. Now, who knows, maybe Pod still would have. Maybe Melton might be just as good a player as DiVincenzo, maybe like not quite the shooter, but a better defender. So I don't think the Warriors necessarily need Donte DiVincenzo right now. Just would add to their depth, of which they've already got plenty, and maybe it'd add some shooting, and you'd prefer him over Buddy Hield or whatever. But I do find it funny how Donte is going to be in this kind of relegated, reduced role. He would have been at the Knicks, and now he will be probably in Minnesota as well. When if he stayed at Golden State, he'd probably be pushing for a starting role. And that also just lends itself to where all three teams are at right now in terms of the certainty of their lineups. And the Warriors obviously far more uncertain than most teams around the league, with Steve already hinting at the fact that it's basically just Steph and Draymond starting, and the other three positions will be figured out and fought for in training camp. So speaking of which, the Warriors have released their 20-man training camp roster. No surprises really there. From what we've seen over the past few days or so, nothing else has particularly happened. You've got the 12 guys on guaranteed contracts, the 2 guys on non-guaranteed contracts in Lindy Waters III and Guy Santos, 3 two-way guys in Quentin Post, Pat Spencer, and Reese Beekman as well, and then the 3 guys on Exhibit 10 contracts, which is Kevin Knox II, fighting for one of those main roster spots, and then Blake Hinton and Jackson Rowe, who could potentially take a 2-way contract if they impress enough in training camp and preseason. Other than that, guys, I'll finish it up. We've got Media Day coming tomorrow. Looking forward to that. I'll have all the coverage on bluemanhoop.com. Aside from that, I'll probably be back within the next 48 hours as well to cover and bring my takeaways from Media Day, some of the notable stuff that was said and whatever else. In the meantime, if you haven't subscribed to the YouTube channel already, that would be greatly appreciated. You can follow me at POC252. That's POK252 on X/Twitter. And I hope you have a great day.